Welcome back to Morning Joe from Washington, Chicago, and New York. Here with us now, Democratic Senator from Indiana and member of the Senate Banking Committee, Senator Evan Bayh, back in the studio. Nice to have you in. Let's look at these poll numbers, and I want to see what you make of them. NBC News Wall Street Journal poll, second on the list in terms of what people feel the government should be working on is spending and the deficit. Can we get those numbers up? I believe first on the list was Chris? Job creation and the economy. But look at this, Senator. People are concerned about the deficit and spending. This is something that we've been talking about on this show for months. Joe has been especially vocal. Healthcare third on the list. Do you think we'll see a change in the language, a change in the messaging out of the White House, responding to perhaps a public sentiment out there that is concerned about living on credit cards?
Well, you've already seen some of that from the White House, Mika. He had a fiscal responsibility summit I was pleased to attend. He ordered his cabinet secretaries
I remember that. It seemed kind of funny at the time.
Well, if you don't mind me interrupting, Senator,
yes, Joe.
He had the fiscal responsibility summit, and then he put out a budget that you and I both know bankrupt this country in the out years. That the CBO said bankrupted the country in the out years. That the head of the Budget Committee in the Senate said bankrupted the country. So it seems to me that it's just words. Do you think they're going to have to pay attention to what you've been saying for some time and now what the polls are saying, that he has to be more fiscally responsible?
Well, Joe, as you know, my views are somewhat in the minority on this issue. I did vote against the budget. I also voted against the omnibus spending bill. So I am concerned about the deficits. And in fairness to the president, I truly believe he is too. They're trying to do a fine balancing act here. In the short run, we do need a more stimulative policy to try and avoid a deflationary spiral. That would be a disaster. So this year and next, you do have to do a little bit more of even what we don't like in the short run. But in the intermediate term, in the longer term, Joe, as you and I both believe, and as Pat and I were talking about before we came on the air, if you run these kinds of deficits, eventually the marketplace has a vote, more than even the Congress. And eventually the Chinese, you're already starting to see some of this, won't want to lend us the money. Well, and that's going to mean higher interest rates and the possibility of a stagflationary period where we get the worst of both worlds. So in the longer term, absolutely, we got to start getting these deficits under control.
Senator, and this is what I don't understand, and you're exactly right. The president has a balancing act. He's got to stimulate the economy over the first 2-3 years of his presidency, but you and I both know that that doesn't require him to produce budgets in the out years that people like you, the CBO director, the head of the Budget Committee, and just about every economist of note says will bankrupt this country. Even the president admits these deficits are unsustainable. So why did he go ahead and push a budget with those type of out years that you know bankrupt this country?
I wasn't a part of those conversations, Joe, and I can only speculate. My speculation is that there were some things that he wanted to get done. I mean, you're on your list as health care. People are concerned about the economy. They've taken steps there. We have to deal with the energy issue. So they wanted to front load those things and then deal with the deficit. If they put that first, it would make dealing with the others more difficult. So my guess is it's a question of sequencing. But look, these people are smart enough to know, as I mentioned, eventually the marketplace will react to this in a very adverse way. And so my hope is, and my expectation is, Joe, that once we're through this summer, for example, they'll pivot and look at things like entitlement reform, some of those things that really drive the deficits in the long run. But as you know, there are nothing but tough decisions to make on that. You spend a lot of political capital. We're going to have to do it. Otherwise, we're going to get the worst of both worlds.
And you're exactly right. This president can still do great things in the long run for the fiscal health of America if he tackles entitlement reform in a tough, brutal, honest way. And I say brutal because politically, you and I both know if you're going to save Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, some unpopular choices are going to have to be made. Let me show you a New York Times poll that was out this morning. Fascinating. More Americans now say they are more focused on the president reducing the size of the deficit than stimulating the economy. Obviously, that's sending shockwaves through the White House this morning, isn't it?
Well, this has been in the back of their minds for some time. You know, Larry Summers, Tim Geithner, the president himself. These are smart people, Joe, and it's a very delicate balancing act. They're doing what they think they need to do in the short run to stimulate the economy and trying to get the rest of the president's agenda enacted, but at the same time they know that you can't run these deficits substantively for economic reasons, but that also politically, you know, people are concerned and focused because as you see interest rates starting to go back up, That's a problem. One of the reasons the price of oil has gone up so much here is because the Chinese are buying commodities. They don't want to buy so many of our bonds anymore. It puts pressure on our dollar. As the dollar goes down, that causes the price of oil to go up. So there are all sorts of adverse consequences to running these kind of deficits. The market is beginning to look into the future and saying, oh my gosh, the Americans are going to inflate their way out of this problem. We don't want to lend them so much money anymore. If we're going to do it, you got to pay us higher interest rates. People are starting to understand that. If something's unsustainable, eventually it's got to stop, and we're starting to see this transition to a hopefully more, a prudent fiscal policy.
Right, and Mika, the problem is that there's no doubt that President Obama inherited a massive national debt, massive deficits. Nobody here is suggesting that he can fix this in 2, 3, even 4 years. The problem, Mika, is politically that his budget in years 5 through 10, again, just presented spending that was even more reckless than George W. Bush's. And trust me, that was reckless spending by President Bush.
I also wonder if these poll numbers, if this starts to gain a little bit and gain some momentum, if it's an opening for the Republicans on a message that they've had a hard time on because they've been hampered, because they've been hypocritical and voiceless for, as I said earlier.
Call voiceless hypocrites these Republicans.
When did hypocrisy stop someone in Washington, Mika?
Sorry.
But Senator, let me ask you about the Fatherhood Responsibility Act, right?
Yes.
That expands the Earned Income Tax Credit, which is a entitlement program, 23 million beneficiaries, and that would increase the deficit, and Senator Bayh is enthusiastically behind it.
Well, let me address that point, Pat. First, to follow up on one last thing that Joe said, there was an analysis in a major publication of only about 7% of the deficit is attributed to this president's policies, but he, because of historic reasons, is in a position to have to tackle it. So I wanted to be fair to the president. Well, we're sort of in a situation, Pat, there where we're going to have to deal with this one way or the other. You're right. The Earned Income Tax Credit does cost a little bit of money. The policy behind it is that if you work 40 hours a week, you shouldn't live in poverty. We want to incent people to work their way out of poverty. The facts also show, Pat, that we spend about $100 billion every year because of the consequences of fatherlessness. Men not earning a living, being responsible for their kids. We don't want to spend that money either. I'd a lot rather have people paid to work than to pay for their kids not getting on drugs, engaging in violence, things like that.
Right, but it's a $45 billion program, I believe, there in income tax credit. No.
Well,
all right.
Not the expansion I proposed.
Oh, no, with expanding an entitlement program.
Well, as I said, I'd rather have people at work. I'd rather have their kids going on the right path in life rather than ending up in prison, not finishing school, that sort of thing.
Rick Stengel has a question. Rick, take it away.
I guess my question is, if we're looking at that poll that we saw this morning, isn't one way to look at it the fact that Americans are beginning to think, okay, we're about to come through the recession, that the economy is actually getting better, and when people feel like things are getting better, they're more concerned about deficits and debt than they are about stimulus. So might they not look at it as the administration that is looking at it as, well, this is a good sign that perception is changing?
Well, there's that possibility. I mean, people may be a lot like the markets, looking a little beyond the horizon and anticipating a recovery. And it also just be good old-fashioned, and I'd like to say, Midwestern common sense, that you can't spend beyond your means forever. They know that as long as we were on the cusp of a deflationary spiral, we had to take some extraordinary actions to deal with this, but now we've got to start walking some of these policies back. And I think that the hardest decision that's going to be made in Washington over the next year is going to be made by the Federal Reserve. They've been pumping so much money into the economy to prevent the collapse of the financial system. Eventually, you've got to start reversing that. Ben Bernanke knows that in the 1930s, they reversed the policy a little too early and caused a second down leg in the Great Depression. So you can't move too precipitously or you get a downturn, but if you let it go too long, you get an inflationary spiral.
All right,
that's a dilemma.
Let's go back to Chicago. Joe Scarborough.
I was just going to say, if we put up the NBC News poll, which shows an even more dramatic split on whether people want to cut the deficit or stimulate the economy, you see a wide swing. And Rick Stengel, no, the White House does not see this as good news, and they don't see it as good news for one reason and one reason alone. They want to push health care now. They understand that the economy is not going to be revived by the midterm elections. They understand that even during the Great Depression, while industrial production went up during the New Deal, unemployment stayed flat, 20% even 5 years into it, 6 years into it. So they need to pass health care so they can take that to the people next year and say, see what we've done for you? The problem now is with these numbers skyrocketing and people being more concerned with the deficit, even if they rightly blame this deficit and debt right now, this year on George W. Bush, this gets in the way of passing comprehensive health care. That's bad political news, Evan Bayh, is it not, for the Obama administration?
Well, it's a tough balance to strike, Joe, and this is another one of these big dilemmas that we currently face. Healthcare costs are a major driver of the deficit, particularly in the longer term. So if you're going to be fiscally responsible, as I think all of us in this discussion here this morning want to be, you've got to come to grips with healthcare reform, getting those costs down. But if you don't do it the right way, ironically, you just add to the cost. So healthcare reform is essential to fiscal responsibility, but it's got to be done in a prudent way that will actually work, and us not just taking the path of least resistance, pretending to deal with the problem in a politically, less painful way, but in fact won't work and just add to the deficits in the out years. And frankly, I was a little concerned. There were some people earlier this week when the Congressional Budget Office scores came out saying how much this was going to cost, wanted to say, well, there's problems with the numbers. Let's ignore the numbers. Let's sort of make up our own numbers. And that just won't work. That will just add to the deficits, and you'll see the markets react against that, and we can't go that path.